He rejected the beautiful sister and chose the one with the scar. God had long since abandoned Redemption Creek, leaving it to fester under a film of rust-colored dust. Its piety was a weapon, and its judgment a slow-acting poison in the air. From the mercantile porch, Nathaniel Blackwood, a ghost in expensive wool, watched the rot unfold. He saw them worship Genevieve Rowe, a perfect porcelain doll, propped up by her father's ambition. But Nathaniel's gaze cut straight through the performance, locking onto the sister they tried to forget. Esther. Her scar was a brutal roadmap of survival, her eyes holding the kind of truth that could get a woman burned in this town. He'd seen this exact poison before the gilded cage, the beautiful lie. It had suffocated the life from a woman whose name was now a ghost on his lips. He hadn't come to Redemption Creek for land. He'd come for a reckoning. Now he would choose the broken one. He would choose the truth. And in doing so, he would either save this town or burn it to the goddamn ground. From the mercantile porch, Nathaniel Blackwood, a ghost in expensive wool, watched the rot unfold. He was a walking vault, a man whose silence was heavier than the gold rumored to line his pockets, and his arrival had sent tremors of greed and suspicion through the town's brittle foundations. He saw them worship Genevieve Rowe, a perfect porcelain doll propped up by her father's ambition, her laughter a bright, false coin in the dusty air. She moved through the small crowd with the practiced grace of a queen, surveying a meager kingdom, her words sweet as honey, her eyes sharp as glass shards. But Nathaniel's gaze cut straight through the performance, a surgeon's scalpel seeking something real. It locked onto the sister they tried to forget, Esther. She stood near the flour barrels, a shadow in a plain calico dress. Her scar, a jagged lightning strike across her cheek and jaw, was a brutal road map of survival. Most folks flinched from it. They looked away, their discomfort a fresh daily wound. Nathaniel leaned forward, his focus absolute. He saw how her hands, though trembling slightly as she counted her coins, were steady and capable. He saw the truth in her eyes, not the fire of defiance, but the deep, quiet waters of a soul that had learned to endure. A soul that had not broken. He'd seen this exact poison before the gilded cage, the beautiful lie. It had suffocated the life from a woman whose name, Annalise, was now a ghost on his lips. He would not watch it happen again. A heavy hand fell on his shoulder, pulling him from his reverie. "Mr. Blackwood," a booming voice declared, "a pleasure to see you gracing our humble town with your presence." It was Sterling Rowe, patriarch and rancher, a man whose ambition was etched into the deep lines of his face. His smile didn't reach his eyes. They were busy calculating, assessing, weighing Nathaniel's worth like a prize steer. "Mr. Rowe," Nathaniel replied, his voice a low, even baritone that gave nothing away. He did not rise. "The town is illuminating." Sterling's laugh was a dry crackle. "It has its charms. My Genevieve, she is the brightest of them all, wouldn't you agree?" He gestured with his chin toward his daughter, who was now holding court by the candy jars. "A man of your standing requires a certain quality. A diamond for a diamond." The offer was as subtle as a swinging saloon door. Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your daughter is indeed the town's adornment." He said the words carefully chosen hollow of the warmth Sterling sought. Just then Esther finished her purchase. Head down, she moved toward the exit, clutching a small burlap sack. As she passed the polished boots of a smirking cowboy, he shifted his weight, a petty, deliberate act. Esther stumbled her sack, slipping from her grasp, its contents spilling across the dusty floorboards with a soft thud. A wave of snickers rippled through the onlookers. Genevieve turned a look of pure, theatrical mortification on her face. Before anyone else could move, Nathaniel was on his feet. He crossed the space in 2 silent strides, kneeling to retrieve the scattered potatoes. He didn't look at the smirking cowboy or the disapproving glares. He looked only at Esther. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden hush, He held the sack out to her. She flinched, her eyes wide with a fear that infuriated him. Not fear of him, but of the attention, of the cruelty she expected. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible, refusing to meet his gaze. She reached for the sack, but he held it for a moment longer. "Look at me," he commanded, not harshly, but with an unnerving stillness. Hesitantly, she lifted her head. Her eyes, a startling shade of storm gray, met his. He saw no malice, no bitterness. Only a profound, aching sorrow, and beneath it a flicker of something unbreakable. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a sign of respect that echoed like a gunshot in the silent store. He released the sack into her trembling hands. As he straightened up, he turned his cold gaze upon Sterling Rowe. The older man's face was a thundercloud of fury and confusion. "You mentioned a Founder's Day dance, Mr. Rowe," Nathaniel said, his voice ringing with a new, dangerous clarity. "I believe I will attend after all." He would attend their dance. He would play their game. And he would burn their expectations to the goddamn ground. The Founder's Day dance was Redemption Creek's most sacred performance. The town hall, usually smelling of stale dust and civic duty, was transformed. Lanterns cast a warm, honeyed glow over faces scrubbed clean and starched collars, the air thick with the sense of pine boughs, cheap perfume, and simmering expectation. A trio of tired musicians sawed away at a waltz, their melody a thin, glittering thread woven through the fabric of hushed gossip. It was a battlefield of silks and whispers, and everyone knew who the prize was tonight. Nathaniel Blackwood stood in the doorway, a figure of stark Eastern elegance against the rough-hewn timber. The music faltered for a half-beat. The whispers died. He was a hawk in a henhouse, his presence sucking the very air from the room. He let his gaze sweep over the crowd, a king surveying an unworthy court. He saw the hungry eyes of mothers with unmarried daughters, the wary glares of the town's self-appointed patriarchs, and the open, arrogant pride of Sterling Rowe, who stood near the punch bowl like a spider in the center of its web. At his side, Genevieve glowed. She was a vision in pale satin, her hair a cascade of perfect curls, her smile a weapon she wielded with devastating precision. She was everything this town valued. Polished, perfect, a beautiful, empty vessel. When she saw Nathaniel, her smile brightened, a predator catching sight of its prey. This was her night, her victory. Sterling moved with the confidence of a man who owned the world, intercepting Nathaniel before he could take 3 steps into the room. "Blackwood, glad you could make it," Sterling boomed, clapping a proprietary hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. "The town has been buzzing. It's not every day we're graced with a man of your caliber. You throw a fine celebration, Rowe," Nathaniel replied, his voice a low counterpoint to Sterling's bluster. He deftly sidestepped, causing Sterling's hand to fall away. "All of this is nothing." Sterling gestured grandly. "Compared to the future, a man needs a legacy, a strong family, a wife who reflects his station." He smiled, turning to his daughter. "Genevieve, my dear, Mr. Blackwood has arrived." She glided toward them, a vision of curated perfection. "Mr. Blackwood," she purred, her eyes alight with triumph. "I was hoping you'd arrive before the first waltz. I've saved it just for you." The musicians, taking their cue, struck the opening chords. It was the moment of coronation. The wealthy stranger would claim the town's princess. The world would be set right. Nathaniel looked at Genevieve. He saw the flawless skin, the perfect smile, and behind it the cold, hard glint of calculation. He saw the ghost of Annalise, another perfect flower who had wilted in a cage of expectation. And he made his choice. "That is very gracious of you, Miss Rowe," he said, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent hall. He then turned his head, his gaze sweeping past her stunned father, across the entire expanse of the polished dance floor. The crowd held its breath, a sea of painted faces, waiting. His eyes found her. Esther. She was half hidden behind a large potted fern near the back wall, as if trying to merge with the shadows. She wore a simple dark blue dress that had clearly been mended. She wasn't watching the spectacle. She was watching the floor, wishing it would swallow her whole. Nathaniel began to walk. Each step was an earthquake. He walked past the mayor, past the sheriff, past rows of open-mouthed women. The only sound was the scrape of his fine leather boots on the floorboards and the lilting, oblivious melody of the waltz. He stopped directly in front of Esther. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide with sheer panic like a deer caught in a hunter's lantern. He extended a gloved hand. "Miss Rowe," he said, his voice soft, but it echoed in the dead silence. "May I have this dance?" Esther stared at his hand as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. "Sir, I do not dance," she stammered, her voice a thread of sound. "Then we shall learn together," he insisted gently, his eyes never leaving hers. A collective gasp swept the room. Behind him he could feel the heat of 100 furious glares. He heard Genevieve's sharp, strangled cry of disbelief. He didn't look back. He simply waited, his hand outstretched, an offer of rebellion in a hostile world. After an eternity, her trembling, scarred hand rose and settled in his. He led her to the center of the floor, a lone, defiant island in a sea of outrage. The dance was clumsy, a hesitant shuffle. But he held her gaze, pulling her into his orbit, forcing the rest of the world to fade away. "Why?" she whispered, her face pale with shock. "Why are you doing this?" He looked down at her, at the raw honesty in her storm-gray eyes, at the scar that told a story of pain and survival. "Perhaps I prefer a story to a portrait, Miss Rowe," he murmured. "Honesty to decoration." The music ended. The final note hung in the air, thick with unspoken violence. The spell was broken. As he led Esther from the floor, a figure blocked their path. It was Sterling Rowe, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes were not on his daughter. They were on Nathaniel. "You have made a grave error tonight, Blackwood." Sterling hissed, his voice dangerously low. "You have made an enemy of the man who built this town." Nathaniel met his gaze without flinching, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "No, Mr. Rowe," he replied, his voice like ice. "You have merely revealed yourself to be the man I already knew you were." The night had fractured the town's fragile mask. As Nathaniel led Esther from the suffocating heat of the hall, the silence that followed them was a living entity, heavy and sharp with malice. Whispers like the rustle of unseen snakes in dry grass coiled at their backs. He stopped his horse-drawn carriage at the entrance to the long, imposing lane of the Rowe Ranch, the moonlight painting the landscape in shades of silver and bone. The air was cold, but not as cold as the stares that had followed them from the dance. Esther had not spoken a single word the entire ride. She sat rigid, a statue carved from fear, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. His kindness had become her cage, and the walls were now closing in. He reached over his movements, slow, and gently placed his fine wool coat over her trembling shoulders. She flinched at his touch but did not pull away. "Esther," he said the first time he had used her given name. His voice was a low rumble in the vast silence. "This is not your fault." She finally turned to him, her face a pale oval in the gloom, her scar a slash of deeper shadow. "Isn't it?" she whispered, and the words were laced with a lifetime of resignation. "They have always needed a monster. Tonight you just gave them a reason to light their torches." She slid from the carriage before he could reply, the coat falling from her shoulders, and fled down the lane toward the dark, looming ranch house, a princess running back to her prison. He watched until her form was swallowed by the shadows, the coat lying like a discarded promise on the seat beside him. The reckoning came with the dawn. Whispers grew teeth overnight. When Nathaniel walked into the mercantile the next morning, the cheerful bell above the door sounded like a death knell. Henderson, the proprietor who had once been obsequious, suddenly found a fascinating spot on the floor to study. "Morning, Henderson." Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through the strained silence. "I need grain for my horses." "Can't help you, Mr. Blackwood," the man muttered, not looking up. "Supply wagon's late." The same wagon that was late yesterday. Nathaniel's voice was dangerously soft. "It seems to have a habit of tardiness where I'm concerned." A woman near the counter, Mrs. Gable, pulled her child closer, as if Nathaniel were the plague itself. "It's the curse," she hissed to her neighbor, loud enough for him to hear. "The Rowe girl's darkness. He's caught it now, bringing ill luck on us all." The poison was already spreading. Sterling Rowe wasn't just turning the town against him, he was weaponizing their fear, using Esther's scar as the focal point for their hatred. It was a classic witch hunt, and he had just handed them their witch. He left the store empty-handed, the weight of their judgment a physical blow. He saw it everywhere. The blacksmith suddenly too busy to take his coin, the children who stopped their games and stared as he passed the curtains that twitched in every window. He was a pariah, and by extension so was she. He knew he couldn't leave her to face this storm alone. He rode out toward the Rowe ranch, a cold fury burning in his gut. The sprawling property was a fortress, its fences like battlements. Two ranch hands, their faces grim and their hands resting on their holsters, blocked the main gate. "Mr. Rowe ain't receiving visitors," one of them grunted. "I'm not here to see Mr. Rowe." Nathaniel stated, his gaze fixed on the house. "I'm here to speak with his daughter." "He said especially not you," the other sneered. There would be no entry. He turned his horse, retreating to a small bluff overlooking the property, a sentinel watching over a siege. He waited. An hour passed. Then he saw her, a flash of dark blue near the smokehouse. She had seen him. She came hesitantly, meeting him at a line of cottonwood trees that marked the edge of the Rowe territory, a no-man's land between them. "You should not have come," she said, her voice tight with anguish. She wrapped her arms around herself. "You have made everything worse. My father has forbidden me from leaving the house. He says I have brought shame upon him. What they're saying in town is not shame, Esther. It is poison." He countered, his voice intense. "They are calling you a curse, a witch. That is a dangerous word in a town like this." "Danger is not new to me, sir." She shot back, a flicker of fire in her eyes. "Being an outcast is the only life I have ever known. Please, for your own sake, just leave. Leave me to it." She was pushing him away, trying to shrink back into the shadows she knew so well. He saw the terror in her eyes, but also the profound, heartbreaking strength of someone who expected to bear the world's cruelty alone. The ghost of Annalise screamed at him to run, to save himself. He ignored it. "No." He said the single word, an unbreakable vow. "I will not. I started this. I exposed their hypocrisy, and they are using you as the price. I will not let you pay my debt." He took a step closer, crossing the property line, an act of open defiance. "They think because you are quiet, you are weak. They think because you are scarred, you are broken. They are wrong, and I am going to prove it." He saw the conflict in her eyes, a desperate yearning for his words to be true, warring with a lifetime of learning they never were. "They have drawn their line in the sand, Esther," he said, his voice dropping to a low, determined growl. "Tomorrow I will draw mine." Nathaniel drew his line in the sand, not with a gun, but with a hammer and nail. The next morning, a notice written in his own clean, sharp script appeared on the town's public board, a stark white wound against the weathered wood. It announced the immediate construction of a new stone-lined public well on the edge of his property and a small schoolhouse open to all children. It also offered steady, generous wages paid in silver at the end of each day for any man willing to work. It was a declaration of war dressed as an act of charity. It was a direct blow to Sterling Rowe's dominion, which thrived on a system of credit and debt that kept half the town in his pocket. Nathaniel was offering freedom a chance for men to earn their own keep without bending a knee to the town's reigning king. The effect was immediate. Men who just yesterday had averted their gazes now approached him with a wary, desperate hope. This, for real, Blackwood, a gaunt-faced farmer named Miller, asked, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. "You pay in real coin, I am." Nathaniel replied, his voice even. "A man's worth is in the sweat of his brow, Miller, not in the rumors he chooses to believe." He was planting seeds of rebellion, not with talk of rights, but with the simple, undeniable weight of silver dollars. He was giving them a choice other than fear. And Sterling Rowe could do nothing but watch and fume as a slow, steady trickle of his power began to erode. The town held its breath, a community stretched taut, waiting for something to snap. It snapped that very night. The first sign was a flicker of angry orange against the bruised twilight sky. Then came the smell, acrid smoke that clawed at the throat. Then the fire bell began to toll, each clang a hammer blow against the heart of the night. The livery stable was ablaze. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, horses screamed from within the burning structure, and the volunteer bucket brigade was a frantic, useless mess. The fire, fed by dry hay and a merciless wind, roared with a life of its own, a hungry beast leaping from the stable to the adjacent shack where the Miller family lived. Redemption Creek was about to be purified by flame. Nathaniel arrived not as a single man, but as a commander. His own ranch hand, summoned by a prearranged signal, galloped in with 2 large water wagons, the first fruits of his new well project. His voice cut through the panic, sharp and clear, a rapier of order in the chaos. "Form 2 lines. Miller, get your family out. You 2 get those horses loose before the roof goes." He was a whirlwind of controlled energy, a stark contrast to Sterling and Genevieve Rowe, who watched from the safety of their porch, their faces illuminated by the distant, destructive glow. Genevieve held a handkerchief to her nose, a portrait of inconvenience. It was then that Nathaniel saw Esther. She stood at the edge of the chaos, her body rigid, her face a pale mask of horror. He could see the terror in her eyes, a primal fear that went beyond the immediate danger. She was staring into the heart of her own past, at the monster that had scarred her. He started toward her, a protective instinct warring with the urgent need to control the blaze. But then a woman's scream tore through the air. "My boy Sammy is still inside." It was Mrs. Miller, her face a mess of soot and tears, being held back by her husband. The back room, he was asleep. The crowd froze. The shack's main room was now a roaring inferno. To enter was suicide. The men, for all their bravado, fell back. But Esther moved. Something inside her, a cord of terror stretched for a lifetime, finally snapped. The fire that had been her tormentor was now a challenge she could not refuse. She ran a blur of dark blue calico, her movements fueled by a knowledge born of tragedy. She knew how fire breathed, how smoke coiled. She knew the path of its hunger. Esther, no Nathaniel, roared, his heart seizing in his chest. She didn't hear him. She ripped a piece of her petticoat, dunked it in a bucket, and wrapped it around her face before disappearing into the churning smoke. The crowd watched, stunned into silence. The cursed one, the witch, had just run into the flames none of them dared to face. An eternity passed in a handful of seconds. The roof groaned, ready to collapse. Nathaniel felt a cold, unfamiliar dread wash over him, the ghost of another failure, another woman lost. Then she emerged, a phoenix from the ashes. She stumbled out of the doorway, choking, her dress singed, but in her arms she clutched the coughing, crying form of the little boy. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, a warrior at the end of her battle. The firelight danced across her face, illuminating her scar, not as a mark of shame, but as a blazing shield. In that moment, under the hellish orange glow, she was the most beautiful and terrible thing they had ever seen. The spell of hatred was broken. The town saw not a witch, but a savior. Later, in the smoky, exhausted aftermath, as the fire was finally beaten into submission, Nathaniel found her sitting on a charred timber, the rescued boy now safe with his mother. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the soot and grime. He reached out his fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his touch lingering for a moment near her scar. His eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a raw, profound admiration. "Esther," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name, "you are without question the bravest person I have ever known." The town watched them, their world turned upside down. The power had shifted. The saint had been revealed as a coward, and the monster had become their hero. In the smoky haze of the fire's aftermath, a new world was being born. The soot-stained townspeople of Redemption Creek, who had spent a lifetime averting their eyes from Esther Rowe, now stared with a raw, open awe. The Miller family was the first to approach their faces, a mixture of exhaustion and profound gratitude. Mrs. Miller fell to her knees, grabbing Esther's hands, her tears leaving clean tracks on her dirty cheeks. "You saved him," she sobbed, pressing Esther's hands to her face. "Bless you, child. You saved my boy." Esther, who had weathered their scorn with silent endurance, was utterly lost in the face of their reverence. She simply stared, overwhelmed, as others echoed their thanks, their voices a rising chorus of praise. For the first time, she was not a ghost in the margins of her own life. She was the center. She was a hero. Nathaniel watched from a step away, a silent guardian. He saw the profound shock in Esther's eyes, the slow, painful dawning of a reality she had never dared to imagine for herself. This was the truth he had seen in her from the beginning. Now the rest of the world was finally catching up. But not all of them. A figure stormed through the crowd, her satin dress now ripped and stained, her perfect curls wild with fury. It was Genevieve. Her face, usually a mask of pleasantries, was twisted into a grotesque sneer of pure, undiluted venom. The porcelain doll had cracked, revealing the ugly clay beneath. "Fools," she shrieked, her voice a shrill tear in the weary quiet. The crowd turned stunned by her ferocity. "Are you all blind? It's a trick. Can't you see she probably set the fire herself? The wretched creature, just so she could play the hero for him." The accusation, so monstrous and absurd, hung in the smoky air. Mr. Miller, his face hardening, stepped in front of his wife. "That's a wicked lie, Miss Rowe. She saved our son's life while you watched from your porch." Genevieve's rage, denied a target in the crowd, turned fully upon its source. She advanced on her sister, her finger pointing like a dagger. "You've always been this way," she spat, her voice dripping with years of curdled jealousy. "Hiding in the shadows, festering with your poison because I am beautiful, and you are that." She gestured violently toward Esther's scar. "You think you can have him. You think your pathetic little act bewitched him. You are nothing but a monster, and you will always be nothing." Before the final cruel word could land, Nathaniel moved. He didn't rush. He simply placed himself between the two sisters, a wall of cold, silent fury. He looked down at Genevieve, his eyes devoid of all passion, holding only a deep, profound contempt. "You speak of beauty, Miss Rowe." He said, his voice quiet, yet it cut through the night like a shard of ice. "Yet in all my life I have never witnessed anything as ugly as what stands before me now." He held her gaze for one devastating second, then turned his back on her. It was not an act of violence, but of erasure, a final, absolute dismissal. Genevieve stood frozen, exposed, and humiliated before the very people she had lorded over her entire life. She looked to her father for support, but Sterling Rowe was a pragmatist above all else. He saw the faces of the townspeople, their awe for one daughter, and their newfound disgust for the other. He saw Nathaniel Blackwood, a man of immense wealth and power, who now stood as protector to the child he had all but disowned. He saw his kingdom crumbling. He made his choice. That is enough. Genevieve Sterling said, his voice flat, devoid of comfort. It was the sound of a king surrendering his crown. Go. Home. Defeated, Genevieve let out a strangled sob and fled into the darkness, her reign of beauty and cruelty finally at an end. In the ensuing silence, Nathaniel turned back to Esther. She was trembling, her face pale beneath the soot, her sister's venomous words having struck a wound far deeper than any fire could. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and steady, an anchor in her swirling sea of emotion. He spoke, his voice ringing with the strength and clarity meant for her, but loud enough for the entire town to hear. There is more wealth in your heart, Esther Rowe, than in all the gold mines in this territory. He declared, his gaze locked with hers. A wealth of courage, a wealth of compassion, a wealth of strength that this town was too blind to see. He lifted her hand, a gesture of profound respect. Any man would be a fool not to count himself the richest soul on earth to simply stand in your light. It was not a proposal. It was a proclamation. The old world of Redemption Creek lay in smoldering ruins around them. The outcasts were now the heroes, and from the ashes a new and uncertain future was waiting to be born. The sun rose on a town of ghosts. Not the vengeful spirits of rumor, but the ghosts of the people they had been just the day before. The morning air, sharp and clean after the night smoke, carried a profound quiet. The townsfolk moved through the streets with a new slowness, their gazes no longer sharp with judgment, but softened with a humbling awe. When they looked at Esther, they saw not a curse, but a miracle. When they looked at Nathaniel, they saw not a threat, but a savior. The reign of fear had been broken by a single act of courage. Nathaniel did not take Esther back to her father's house. That home, with its polished surfaces and shadowed corners, was part of a life that no longer fit her. Instead, he brought her to his own, the sprawling, neglected expanse of the Circle C Ranch. It was a place of good bones and forgotten potential, its fences sagging, its main house a grand but lonely silhouette against the wide-open sky. It was a mirror of them both, scarred and weathered, but standing and ready to be rebuilt. He led her onto the porch as the morning light spilled across the valley. "It's not much yet," he said, his voice quiet. "It needs work, a steady hand." Esther looked out at the vast, untamed land, at the promise of a new beginning. She touched the porch, railing its wood, silvered with age. "So do we all, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered. Their quiet was interrupted by the slow, deliberate approach of a lone rider. It was Sterling Rowe. The fire had burned the arrogance from him, leaving a man stooped and weary, his authority stripped away to reveal the fragile bones beneath. He dismounted, his movements heavy, and stopped before the porch, his hat in his hands. He looked not at Nathaniel, but at his daughter. "The town. They are calling you the Angel of the Ashes," he said, his voice raspy. "Your sister. Genevieve has locked herself in her room. She will see no one." He took a ragged breath. "I was a fool, Esther, a blind, arrogant fool. I spent a lifetime polishing a piece of glass while I had a diamond hidden away in the dark." He finally met her eyes, his own filled with a shame that was 20 years too late. "I cannot ask for your forgiveness, but I can ask that you might one day let me be your father again." Esther looked at the broken man before her, the source of so much of her silent pain. She saw no triumph in his defeat, only a shared human sorrow. She gave a single slow nod. "You have always been my father," she said, her voice clear and steady, an act of grace that cost her everything and yet made her whole. Sterling looked at Nathaniel, a flicker of his old self returning, but this time as respect. You saw what I refused to see. This town needs a new foundation. It needs you." "I have no interest in ruling," Ro Nathaniel replied, his gaze on Esther. "But I will help it rebuild." After her father left, a fragile peace settled between them. They stood on the porch, two survivors on the shore of a new world. The air was full of unspoken things of a future that was both terrifying and brilliant with possibility. "The people are kind now," Esther said softly, her hand rising in an old, familiar gesture to touch her scar. "But they still see this. And you, Nathaniel. You could have a world of perfect portraits." He reached out and gently caught her hand, his fingers enclosing hers, stopping the motion. He held it, not letting go. "Annalise," he said, the ghost's name finally spoken aloud. "She was a perfect portrait. Flawless. And the world of men like your father broke her because she was never allowed to be anything else. They loved the painting, not the person." He turned to face her fully, his eyes holding an aching vulnerability she had never seen. "I failed her. I did not see the cracks in the porcelain until it was too late." He looked at her scar, his gaze full of a reverence that made her breath catch. "This is not a flaw, Esther. This is a testament. It is the story of the woman who walked through fire and saved a life. It is the most honest, beautiful thing in this entire God-forsaken town." He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture of profound tenderness. "I am done with portraits. I am done with gilded cages." His voice was a raw, unbreakable vow. "I choose the story. I choose the survivor. I choose you." She looked up at him, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but partnership. She saw a reflection of her own scarred, resilient soul. And for the first time in her life, she did not feel the pull of the shadows. She felt the warmth of the rising sun. Together, they turned and looked out at the waiting land, at the home they would build from the ruins, a new legacy founded not on beauty or gold, but on the stubborn, unshakable truth of a story worth telling.